Okay, let's start with today session is on exception handling, Mule exception handling. Basically, if you go right before we discuss this Mule exception handling, let's discuss about what actually the exception handling. Why do we need exception handling? All right. So in general, right, in any application or software development, right, as developer, we keep writing the code for our business logic or for our requirement. So unfortunately, sometimes unexpectedly, some input might go wrong or it's a bad input provided. It is not always expected the user is sending the right input, but maybe some unintentional glitches will be there in the program. So when such bad input is provided to the program, right, the program will not execute as expected. It come up with the errors. So those errors are always not handled. Some errors we can handle and proceed to execute the rest of the program. Some scenarios we cannot proceed our program without this logic execution and we got that particular code execution. So like the different scenarios, right, we have to have a exception handling. How do your program run? Whether your program has to terminate, means not terminate, has to stop executing that flow, or if you want to ignore that exception and go ahead with the rest of the flow, that based on that execution, right, based on the expected, we have to handle that. Handling of exception is important. Handle any minor exceptions if it is not mandatory and if it is not required and to complete your flow, then you can ignore, you can skip such small minor exceptions and continue with the rest of the flow. So to do that, we have this exception handling mechanism. It's just something same as Java only. Java we have, right, different things are there, right? Using try catch, we can handle the exception, and we can means we handle the exception, we can continue the rest of the flow with the help of try catch. If you talk about the throw keys, right, throws is used to throws multiple exceptions at the method level, and throw is used to throw a specific exception, right? It can be a built-in Java exception or it can be a custom exception. So different based on the scenario, right, we have to have that mechanism to handle the exception. The same way in Mule also we have exception handling mechanism, which is more powerful feature, an important feature. We have a powerful mechanism in Mule. So before we discuss about that, let's discuss about some rules, right? When we add any exception scope, what exception scope we have to add, how do we add, when do we add, where we add a particular exception scope. So for that, we have some rules to be followed. So if you understand that rules, right, it is easy for you what type of exception, when, in where you add that exception, and when which flow you can add that, what you do that if you use that particular exception scope. Okay, let's talk. As told you, right, exception handling or error handling, it is a mechanism wherein the errors are controlled. Means we have to control those errors, and some flow is executed when errors in the flow. Say we talk about Mule, we have a number of flows, right? Like in our application, right, we can have a number of flows for one application. So when the flow is executed, unfortunately, somewhere the execution might happen in any of the processor. What you do, say, if you want to handle this exception and continue the rest of the flow, or if you want to um, throw the exception, means if you want to terminate this execution of this flow and go back and execute the uh, calling flow, or if you want to come out of this without executing the logic further, means without processing your request further and go back with the exception to the user, means we have to control, how to control that based on the exception scope. So exception or error handling can be done at the project level using default error handler. What is default error handler? How this will be coming to picture, who will provide this, we'll see that in detail in the next section. At project level also we use custom exception handling, means we also have a custom exception handling. What it means I will explain. At the flow level, exception handling using on error propagate, on error continued, on raise error. So where we see this one, right? If we have a separate error scope, you see that error, you just type error. You could see this one on error handler is the error handler, means it is used to handle errors. You could see this the message. This component execute when an error is raised and routes it to the first matching handler. It can contain any number of internal handlers. For example, on error continue, on error propagate, and support handle matching by route, which means that it is just a common global handler where it route that error that is raised in this flow, which error where it has to route means based on the exception scope we have to use. What is that? On error continue or on error propagate. So these are separate, three separate exception scope: on error propagate, error continue, and raise error. Raise error is nothing but a custom error, and error handler is the one where we are specifying what type of exception handling, what type of exception we are going to handle. So everything we have to set in this error handler file. So this is what we are about talking about: on error propagate, on error continue, raise error. Now, this also can be handled exception right within the flow or processor level, which means like, so this is a processor. In a flow, we can have n number of processor. This is a logger component. This means it is doing some process. What it is doing, it is logging the information to the user to trace the program, and this is one processor which is deleting. So like that, any number of processor there in a flow. So exception handling can be done at the processor level. So how you do that? Using try catch. It is same as our Java try catch. If you remember the Java try catch, how it looks: try followed by catch. Same way in Mule also we have try scope. We call it as a try scope. If you just say right click, wrap in, see, try, right? The moment you say, it will be wrapped in the try, and it is a like a catch block of Java. Exception handling means what type of exception scope, what is the exception scope that you are going to provide it here. So either on error continue or error propagate, you can choose and put it here, drag here. So this is how you can handle exception at the processor level also. So that is what I'm talking, right? Next, error handlers contain one or more error handling scope. As we see this error handler, we can write this error handler. So this one, drag this one here, you can have a number of error handlers, error handler scopes, right? That's what this point saying. Error handler can contain one or more error handling scope. This is the global is the error handler where it handles all types of errors. On error continue, on error propagate, like that you can have a number of error continues and error propagate. But we have to define, you have to specify on error continue means what type of error, when this particular exception come. Okay, say value, some calculation is that, but that is not needed for you to go ahead with the next process. Then you can specify the type of error: arithmetic error, index of bound error, or null pointer error, whatever it may be. So you have to list all the errors in on error continue. Like you can have a number of on error continues in your exception handler. Okay, next. Now these are the rules that, as I told, right, we have to understand this, be patient and listen carefully and follow these rules when we are implementing a exception handling. So what rules are there? First, check if anything present in error handling. Means we have to check anything is present, if have we handle any exceptions there, even if there are on error propagate or on error continue, as we seen here, right? On error propagate, on error continue, right? This, and also check if that particular error type is handled. If not, then we'll use default error handling. However, what is that, right? As you in this exception, right, in this flow, in that processor, right, you handle the exception, but this you are saying this is a SQL exception, right? But in that on error propagate or error continue, no matter which one you have used it here, for example, right, you have used this on error continue, but here you have not say that the specific exception is DB execution exception, right? These two processor or any one of these processor is failed, right? Both related to DB execution. But if you have not specified in this on error continue the particular exception type, means you have not catch that, then the Mule provide the default exception handling. So Mills will give that because you have not given, you have given something as with bad syntax, or maybe data not found something you said, but actually this exception is saying DB execution, query execution error, but query execution is error due to SQL syntax error or something, means it is not executed the query, means it is failed to execute query in the database. So you have not given that. So who will do that job? Mulsop default exception handling. So it is saying that if the particular error type is handled, you said, if not, then Mule will provide default error handling. So even if you don't use anything also, right, Mule will always provide you default error handling. As we seen in the previous videos, right, if there is any syntax issue, we could see this in the console as DB execution error, right? Who is providing that error? Mule is providing the default exception handling for us. If you don't, but you can ask me a question, if Mule is providing default exception handling, why we have to implement this exception? Because to see that message clearly, right? To understand the end user what went wrong, what he can see, what next he can do, that he has to understand what is went wrong then in the system. So how you know this? It is displaying somewhere in the console. If you display some bulk message, right, it's a number of lines, user cannot understand just reading that. So we have to give a generic message, meaningful message to the end user to understand that what is that error, so what he can do further. That's why we are we are using this exception scope to give more meaningful message to the end user. Right. Next, if your flow is not called by another flow, sorry, this should be if your flow is not called by any other flow, then it will display default value that is set in the error response section of HTTP listener and give the 500. What it means, right? Now, if your flow is not called by any exception, right, then there is an as told you, right, Mule provide the default exception handling, right? What message you could see here, then there is a default error handle, there is a default errors message that is set in the response, right? You see this one, this is the success response, and there is one more part, error response. It is saying error dot description, which means we are not given our custom message, right? Such scenarios, right, Mule the flow already have a default error message that need to display. What it is displaying from the error object, the field description will be taken and displayed to you as a part of output. Okay, well, what is the status for that? It is status is 500 code, because that you have not provided anything. So default status is the 500. Means something went wrong on the server. Okay.
Internal server error, right? That one.
If some error handling is present in that particular flow and error type is handled, check whether it is on error or propagate, which means saying that now in the flow, in the current flow execution, right, if we handle error continue, on error propagate, we have to check what error scope we have handled. For example, if the error scope is on continue, so what it will see that then if the error continue is used here, it will check this is the only one flow here, which means if the error continue is used, and if you have used on error continue, what it do, it will stop executing the rest of the event processor. Wherever the exception happening here, it will stop here and return the response to user as a 200 on error continue, because that is the difference of that. Error continue always return a success code 200, but error message it will return error message. But if you use on error propagate, then what it do, if it is and again it is a one flow, right? If you use an error propagate, what it happens that immediately it will throw the exception, means propagate in the sense throwing the exception, throw the exception back to the listener and display the default error message with the status 500. What is the difference here? It is always both return the error message, but this returns on error continue returns status code is 200 and this status code is 500. So that is the difference both. It will throw the exception. Suppose if your flow, this is the main flow, assume, and this is the subflow. So using flow reference, for example, here, let's see now. This is the flow reference that we will talk about the detail in flow reference when we are discussing the flows. Now, using flow reference, what to do if this flow is called by this flow, and this is the parent flow, and this is the child flow. So that case, what happens if you are calling this flow from the parent flow, and the scope we have used is on error continue, which means if the error continue is handled here, what it say, okay, but here if the exception happen any one of this flow, what it do, it just catch the exception and return the status code is 200 with the error message. From assume this is the flow reference, from this flow reference here anyway it is handle the exception, but it continues the rest of the flow. But the same on error continue is used here and it does not have any parent child flow. What happens, it will terminate there and return the response back. So that is the difference, right? If we have a single flow and it will stop processing from that event, right, event processor, then it will go back with the error response, error message with the 200 status code. And if it is in the child flow, means on error continue, if you use in the child flow, what happens, then it will stop processing the next processor in this child flow and return back to parent flow with the status code 200 and the error message, but it will continue the rest of the flow at the parent. But the same is not applicable on error propagate. On error propagate, what it says, this guy is say some exception is thrown. He will say return throws here. He throws the exception to this guy. I'm not able to do this, that. Okay. You only do say guy, some exception is happening. You decide what you do. Means this guy will go with the 500 status and the error message. If something is handled here, for example, if you don't handle anything, what you do, this guy is not able to do. You are throwing, hey guy, you are throwing exception. I don't have any exception handling. I cannot do anything. Whatever the exception you throw here, I will simply return back to listener. I cannot do anything because I am not able to handle exception. What did this guy do? Just simply go back with the same error code and response to the listener. In another scenario, on this error propagate is used in the child flow. If this guy throw exception, this guy checks if have exception. Now the first scenario, we don't have an exception handling, and checks it. Second scenario, if this guy having any error scope, right? For example, error propagate. Again, this say on error propagate. Hey, you are throwing exception. Here I am also, my job is also to throw the exception. I cannot handle. What I do, throwing exception, this guy throwing exception, this guy also throwing exception. Who will handle that? No one is there. So it go back to the listener with the status 500 and the error messages. Suppose in the third scenario, if this guy on error propagate throw the exception to the calling flow, to the parent flow, and this parent is say on error continue. What to say, oh, this guy is throwing exception here, this something is happened here. What to do? Well, I cannot do that. Even see this guy, someone is throwing exception, even though on error continue also, what to do, instead of giving 500 error code, this guy is the one which controlling that 500 to 200 and return back the error message to the listener. So this is how these two are working on parent and child flows. Now, but note one thing, but it will not continue to other process in the same flow where error is handling. What is that on error continue case? I told you, right? If it is within the same flow, even though an error continue is used, as told you that simple instructions, simple thing, step. If you used on error continue, if it is used in the same flow, then it will not execute for the event processor. If it is in the child flow, then it will not execute anything in the child flow, but continue the parent flow. Let's see next words. Next, what is the next rules? Error handling. Suppose we have a single flow that we have discussed, right? As told, on error propagate, on error continue behaves same way. But see, on a single flow, right? This is the only one flow. What I told you, right? On error propagate gives you 400. On error continue gives 200. You see the difference? If it is a single flow, both stop executing the rest of the flow, but they return back to the listener with message, same error message, but status code is different for this. It is a 200 for continue and 500 for propagate. That is the only difference. When we have a multiple flows, then the behavior will be different as discussed now, as told based on the previous point. If it is error continue, it will not go to the next processor within the flow where our error is handled. So always please remember this point. On error continue will continue only to the next processor of calling flow, but not within the same flow. As told, right? If this is a parent and this is a child, and on error continue make you to continue to the parent flow, but not the where exception is happen. Right? As told, this error continue is here, right? It catch anyway the catch exception and tells guys, okay, I handle the exception. You go ahead with the rest of the processor. Okay, to understand in this detail. Okay, we'll do a hands-on examples. So that case you will understand each and everything clearly. No worry. Now, next last thing is that default error handling. What is a default error handling? Basically, I told you, right? If any exception happened in our flows, right, we are checking it is in the local error handler, or if it is not there, and then we go for a global exception handler like error handler. So it will check that error handling is there in the flow level or processor level or global exception hand level. If no one is doing that, nothing, no one is handling the exception, then Mule will decide that to handle the exception itself. That is called as a default error handler. So when an error is thrown, an error object is created, means when the Mule flow start executing that, if something happened here, then it checks first anyone is handle exception in this flow level or processor level. No, it is not. Then it checks the global exception handling also. Nowhere exception handling is there, then we'll create a error object for this and throw the exception object with the 500, always 500, and the corresponding error message. That message, how it is displayed as a part of error response, as we see in this here, error response body. This one, this is used for error response. Whenever error response is raised, then only this will come into picture. Otherwise, always for 200, this one, this is for 500, means all the error responses. So this we call it as a largest way. Why largest way we call this? Means it is first checking if someone is there to do my job, why I have to go wake up to handle my exception myself. So that is called it as a largest way. If someone is already doing or someone is already handling the exception, then I will check. If someone is there to do my job, then I cannot do. So once if no one is there, I will do my job. What is my job to handle the exceptions? That's why we call it as a largest way of handling error. Means it is after all checking, then this guy is wake up to do his job. If you don't, again when it will, if you don't handle any error, then only this guy do that. Otherwise, he never do that. Okay. What is Mule way to handle error? Well, last question. When a flow is processing a Mule message, right, that raises an error, the normal execution of the flow stop. What it do then the flow stop, the transfer, it control the transfer, means the transfer control back to the default error handler. What is the default error handler? Mule is the default error handler. So how would this guy do? Mule default error handler always use an error propagate. It means this guy always say handle exception himself, right? Why I have to handle, why I have to handle? First handling exception is the its default job. Once he handle exception, he cannot let the flow to continue anymore, which means this guy is always equals to an error propagate. Any exception that is handled by the Mule is always on error propagate only. This guy will never handle any exception. Let continue your flow. means always throw the exception, let come out of the flow. So this is how the exception handling will work. Always remember these three rules and what error scope you are using, where you are using that scope, and are using the single flow or using the multiple flows, then how you can use these error scopes. Be careful that, see, if you want your flow, you want to continue with that, and it is a child flow or parent flow, right? Just based on that scenario, business logic execution, flow execution, you have to use this error handling mechanism. You cannot just put something like that, right? And if it is that something right now in our scenario, right, after deleting, right, then what we are expecting, we just select using the select statement. But this is not mandatory for us. Let's take an example, right? After deleting the record, anyway, it is deleted the record, and you could see that a query execution is successfully happen. Then why you want to see this? This is optionally have done, means this flow, even if without executing this processor also, your request is processed successfully, right? So such things, right, you can wrap it in the try catch, which means, right, now when you use this try catch with error continue, what you are saying, okay, something happened here, I will catch this exception and say continue. But it's saying it is handled. You see the difference I said, right? If you use error on error continue within the flow, it will not execute the next processor. But this case on try catch means it is catching the exception here itself, which means I am doing this guy, I hold this guy, you no need to worry, you can go ahead with the next processor. So that is the difference of try scope. It catches, right, it catches the completely. This guy is something similar to you are calling the next flow. This is how this try works. It here completely catch the exception, and it will let you continue to execute the rest of the flow. So these are all the things we always have to keep in mind and go with the error handling. So, and this is one of the main topic and important topic that everyone has to understand, and you have to definitely do a hands-on to make this understand in more detail. Right? We can explain more and more flows, right, create more number of flows, right, parent child flows, and right, handle use those all different types of exception scope with the global exception handler. Then only you can understand this clearly. Otherwise, without hands-on, I'm surely saying that it never come, it never understand that. Listening is one thing. If you do a hands-on, right, once also it will not help you. Please do hands-on, more examples practically, then you will understand this clearly. Hope it's clear what is exception handling and the rules of exception handling. Any doubts? Hello?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good.